Welcome to day 2 of the Canadian Domestic Homicide Prevention Conference. My name is Kate Rossiter. I'm with the Ending Violence Association of BC and Simon Fraser University. It's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this morning's plenary on risk assessment and management with vulnerable populations. I'll just give you a snippet of the bios, but the full bios are in the program. First, we'll hear from Dr. Zoe Hilton, who is the Senior Research Scientist at Waypoint Center for Mental Health Care. She has over 25 years of experience both as a frontline clinician and as a full-time researcher. We'll then hear from Dr. Randy Kropp, who's a clinical and forensic psychologist with the Forensic Psychiatric Services Commission of British Columbia, an adjunct professor of psychology at Simon Fraser University. Then we have 4 panelists, starting with Dr. Mohammed Baobaid, who's the executive director and founder of the Muslim Resource Centre for Social Support and Integration here in London, Ontario. We'll then hear from Josie Nepinak, who's Anishinaabe from the Treaty 4 area and is the executive director of the Aodan Healing Lodge Society, the only Aboriginal urban women's shelter in Alberta. Next, we have the Honourable Donna Martinson, who is a judge for 21 years, both with the British Columbia Supreme Court and Provincial Court, and who's currently associated with the Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia and the Frida Centre for Research on Violence Against Women and Children at Simon Fraser University. And last but not least, Crystal Giesbrecht, who's the Director of Research and Communications at the Provincial Association of Transition Houses and Services of Saskatchewan. It's the member association for 21 domestic violence shelters and counseling centers in the province.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Peter and Myrna, for the opportunity to speak here today. It's an honor to be speaking to you today and in this place, and with my esteemed co-panelists. Okay, so in its second domestic homicide brief, the initiative said that those conducting risk assessments should use structured, reliable, validated, and defensible risk assessment tools or guidelines. So the initiative doesn't have a position on which approach or which tool to be using. And you at this conference have been hearing about a number of tools that are structured, validated tools. And I'm going to be focusing on one approach, the actuarial approach, and in particular on the Ontario Domestic Assault Risk Assessment, or ODARA, which is an actuarial tool. So actuarial has to do with the statistical calculation of risk. It's an approach that's used in many fields, including the insurance industry and medical health, and as it turns out, in violence risk assessment as well. Actuarial methods have to do with measuring risks or potential risk factors at a given point in time, and then following up a sample or a group, in this case domestic offenders, for example, following them up and measuring the outcome as well. So that every item that's on an actuarial tool is a risk factor that has been shown to be measured at one time and related to an outcome at a later time. So this, an actuarial tool is scored. Each item on an actuarial tool has a score, and the total score is the conclusion of the tool to an extent is the sum of all the item scores, and that sum relates to an individual's estimated risk and also a rank order, so how an individual compares with other domestic offenders who have been assessed. So, as I said, actuarial tools are used in a variety of fields, including medical risk assessment. And I was actually able to go online and evaluate my own risk of developing breast cancer. So this tool allowed me to enter my individual level, my own information, and it told me two things. One, it told me what my risk of developing breast cancer is in my lifetime, up to the age of 90, which might be a little optimistic. But secondly, it also told me how my risk compares to others based on large studies. So an actuarial tool can tell you both individual information to help you either communicate to a victim that you're supporting, or help you make decisions about an individual perpetrator that you may be treating or deciding on a variety of different risk management strategies for. But it also helps at a more population level or policy level, because planning can be made for how many people you may expect to need certain resources for. And in particular, actuarial tools fit with the risk, need, and responsivity principles, whereby we give the most risk management interventions or actions to those people who represent the highest risk of either perpetration or victimization. So the ODARA, being an actuarial tool, gives this kind of information. It can be presented in a figure like this. So for people who are comfortable with reading figures or enjoy the statistics, this table, this figure can tell us a number of things. First, it tells us that with increasing ODARA scores along the bottom, you see increasing risk of domestic violence recidivism. It also tells us that, shows that we have done a number of studies and found the same pattern, validating the ODARA in different studies. The line also shows the distribution, or a summary we can take from that is that at the extreme ends of risk, we see relatively fewer perpetrators. And this is based on research with male perpetrators of domestic violence. The results don't have to be displayed in a figure like this. They can also be summarized in a table that we would call an actuarial table. And here you would find the ODARA score down the first column, and you can look over to see an individual's estimated risk in the next column. And perhaps more importantly, the other columns also show where an individual stands with respect to others who have been assessed on the ODARA. It can also be communicated like this, and these pie charts were suggested to us by nurses who were working with female victims of domestic violence at Ontario's sexual assault and domestic violence treatment centres. They found this was a more user-friendly communication for their clients, but it still also shows the estimated risk in the shaded areas of the graph and where people stand with respect to each other by looking at the whole row, the whole column of the pie charts. It can also be expressed like this, which to me is quite user-friendly and very similar to what I received when I assessed my risk for developing breast cancer. So I've mentioned the ODARA. I haven't really talked about what the ODARA is other than an actuarial tool. This is a screenshot from ODARA 101, our online training for the tool. And this is a piece that you would see after doing the learning modules and when you've been through some practice videos and you get the opportunity to practice scoring the ODARA and each individual item. So the first few items have to do with the perpetrator's criminal history, such as prior domestic assault and a police or criminal record. The three items after that have to do with things that occurred at the most recent domestic assault, like threats, confinement, the victim's concern about future assaults. And the remaining items have to do with aspects of the relationship and the circumstances, their children, any assaults during pregnancy, barriers to accessing support, and so on. So that's just a brief summary of the ODARA. And now I would like to talk a little bit about choosing a risk assessment tool. I have just picked out 5 different principles in choosing a tool, and each agency or jurisdiction needs to choose the tool or the approach that is right for them, that's going to be the most effective in supporting their risk management procedures. So validation refers to whether a tool has been tested, especially in multiple studies, to make sure that the tool itself or the items on that tool or the summary statements from that tool are actually related to domestic violence recidivism in the case of the tools that we're talking about. And all the major tools that you're hearing about at this conference have been validated. I would include in validation inter-rater reliability or agreement. That is, if I score the ODARA in a particular situation and Peter scores the ODARA in the same situation, do we come up with the same score? Because if we are scoring the ODARA differently, if it's a different score every time, then it can't be used in a valid way. And we have done a number of studies on the ODARA finding that we have good agreement in that way. Generalization has to do with, okay, we've maybe validated the tool in one sort of population. Does it generalize to another population? So here's where we want to see studies done in different countries and so on, or in different settings, such as the victim advocacy setting or the police or corrections setting. Generalization also, in domestic violence risk assessment, there is a big issue with whether tools that are developed for male perpetrators with female victims will generalize to female perpetrators or to perpetrators and victims in a same-sex relationship. We do have a number of studies now validating the ODARA for female perpetrators, and we want to see more happening in that direction. And we are hoping to see more work done, or at least some work done with the ODARA in same-sex relationship violence. And that really is an area that is a current challenge for domestic violence risk assessment for all our tools. Information has to do with whether you have the information needed to complete the risk assessment tool or approach that you want to use. For example, the ODARA was developed for frontline use with victims or in policing circumstances. But we have a sister tool called the DVRAG that requires using the psychopathy checklist, which is a restricted psychological tool that takes a lot of background information. So depending on your circumstance, you may not be able to use that tool. So that's part of that decision about the choice. Communication is another issue. Is this something, a tool that's going to help you communicate back to the people you serve, perhaps to share the information with a victim who has given you her information? How do you share that back with her in terms of a risk assessment result? And does that help her make decisions about her own safety and move forward? Is this a tool that police can use also to communicate with the courts, or with probation, and can shelter staff use this tool with their clients and then communicate with their local policing services about the level of risk in an individual case or in general in the community that they're serving? And my final point is about education. So you've selected a tool. Can you access the education that you might need? Is there education needed for this tool? Is it accessible? Is it affordable? Is it timely? Can you get if you have a crew of staff you want trained, can you make sure that your training needs are met? So I've said a little bit about ODARA 101. I'm not going to say any more at this point, but we do have a showcase out there in the break if you want to come see me there. So just in summarizing about risk management and safety planning, I think both of these processes consist of all the decisions that we make, whether it's about a perpetrator, we need to decide what's going to happen, or in a victim's case, if they're deciding, making a number of decisions for their own safety. We make decisions with relation to risk management and safety planning all the time. And it's always with some notion of risk in mind, whether it's a gut reaction, a gut sense of what this perpetrator might be capable of, or whether it's a structured, validated, scored tool, or however it may be. If we're using structured, validated tools, we can increase the effectiveness of our risk management and safety planning. Actuarial tools especially are designed to work with the principles of effective intervention so that we can be doing the most intensive, the most extensive, the broadest risk management for perpetrators who represent the highest risk. And we can be planning for this at a policy level as well. Okay, well, then, thank you very much for your attention. And I will hand over to our next speaker.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about this challenging topic. So we had talked about how to make this sort of the most practically useful talk, and well, at least I talked about this with Peter. And we thought talking about this issue of linking intimate partner violence risk assessment to risk management is a very important one, because it's always been our philosophy that risk assessment is nothing without good risk management plans. Risk assessment is nothing if it can't inform us about actually what to do with the case. But before I get into that, I think I had to put this in here because when I was putting these slides together, my daughter emailed me this picture. This is the puppy that she's finally getting after asking for a puppy for 5 years. So I thought it can't hurt to show a puppy at a conference like this. Yesterday was really heavy, so I'm pretty excited to meet this little girl. I learned the hard way when I first started doing threat assessments. I can remember I was doing a dangerous offender assessment. I went through, and I thought I was pretty smart, and I went through and I used all the available tools. It was a sex offender who had also had a history of domestic violence. And I did my risk assessment, I sent it into the court, and I got a polite response. Thank you very much, Dr. Kropp, but could you provide us with some useful information? And I thought, well, and I almost retired at that point. But the response was, can you actually tell us what to do with this case? Because what we're struggling with here in court is, can we manage this person in the community? If we place him in the community, how can we prevent him from reoffending? So that experience and others really influenced our approach to developing risk assessment measures. And the whole idea would be, can we develop something like the SARA, which was the Spousal Assault Risk Assessment Guide, was the first tool we developed. There's sort of a one-stop shopping where we can actually guide people through the entire process of risk assessment and to the point where they're making good risk management plans. So it's a process that we're actually trying, with the tools that I've been involved in developing, that we're trying to actually help people through. We think people, regardless of where you're working, whether it's victims, offenders, you are doing risk assessments, threat assessments anyways, whether you're using a tool or not. We wanted to basically guide you through that process in the most structured way possible. So there's sort of 4 general principles or steps that I would suggest are important. The first is to identify risk factors, then to think about the actual relevance of those risk factors, to think about risk scenarios, and then build management plans on top of those scenarios. So let me just walk through this. So when we're thinking about identifying risk factors, you've seen lots of risk tools, and there's lots of these lists of risk factors, and I echo Zoe's thoughts about this. We have to focus on risk factors that have some empirical relevance in the literature whenever possible. So we want risk factors that have been validated in the literature and show some predictive accuracy. Our approach is a little different in that we would also want to include risk factors that we believe might be difficult to empirically validate, but might have some professional and practical utility in the sense that the professional consensus out there is that there are some risk factors that are important to consider that may be difficult or rare or hard to validate. And then there's the whole legal question about using risk factors that are fair, that don't discriminate. They don't use ascribed characteristics of individuals. So, we can't talk about skin color, even if there was, an empirical association between skin color and violent behavior. It's unhelpful to do that. It's discriminatory, and it's not actually addressing what the underlying risk is. So, risk factors need to be fair and reasonable. You'll see, I agree with Zoe that we have to use structure. If we do threat assessments without any structure, we do not get reliable risk assessments. It's as simple as that, and the literature and the research is pretty clear about that. Risk assessments need to be contextual, so we need to always think about the individual case that we're assessing and think about the context in which that violence is occurring in that family. So we believe in thinking about static and dynamic and flexible risk factors in the assessment. So this is just the Be Safer. So this is an example of the structured professional judgment approach to risk assessment. Some of you will be familiar with the Be Safer. It was like our shortened version of the SARA. So you can see we have risk factors related to the violence itself. So we think about violent acts, threats, escalation of that violence, violation of court orders, and attitudes that support or condone violence. We think about the psychosocial adjustment of the perpetrator. So think about general criminal attitudes, behaviors, intimate relationship problems, substance use problems, mental health problems, and so forth. And then finally, victim vulnerability factors. Attitudes and behaviors of the victim, and this is not, of course, to hold victims responsible for the violence that's being perpetrated against them, but it's understanding the vulnerabilities and barriers. So fear, support networks, living situation, health problems, and so forth. So a lot of you work with victims. This is basically the stuff of a good safety plan. This is important because, again, we're going to see that risk management, as I define it, will include victim safety planning. We can't do risk management of the offender without considering victim safety planning with the victim. It's two sides of the same coin. So the next thing is think, well, a risk factor can be there historically, but is it actually relevant? We can go through a list of risk factors and check off a number of factors, but we don't actually think they're relevant right now to the risks that this person poses. So we ask people to think about, does the risk factor actually have some kind of causal relationship to this person's violence? And I'm talking about this later this afternoon in more detail, but we can think about relevance in a number of different ways, but we think about, does it motivate the person to be violent? Is he motivated by revenge, or is he motivated by power and control? Is he motivated by proximity to the victim, affiliation? There's a number of different reasons why men are violent, and women. The other way a risk factor can be relevant, it's actually just going to complicate management for us. So it's going to make it difficult to implement good management strategies. So a risk factor can, we take a decision-making model with risk assessment, and we think that violence is a decision. And what we want to try to understand is, why is this perpetrator deciding to behave this way? So we want to try to, in a way, get into his head and think about what's he trying to accomplish, what might be disinhibiting him, so preventing him from appreciating the consequences of the behavior, both to himself and to the victim. And then what factors might be destabilizing him, screwing up his thinking, just affecting his ability to make good decisions. And it's risk factors that are impinging on the decisions, and that's how we decide which risk factors we want to really focus on. This isn't as difficult to do as you might expect if we actually put in some structure to the process. The next stage we would talk about is developing scenarios. Now, this again is a process where we want people to step back and think about, what bad things are we worried about here? Now, this is something that we do naturally anyways. I mean, anyone that works with victims or offenders has those sleepless nights. You're thinking, what is going to happen tomorrow? Is that guy going to do it? Is he going to kill her? Is he going to abduct her and the children? We are running these scenarios, usually very bad scenarios, through our heads all the time. And that's how we think we build good plans. We can't build management strategies without having a good plan and without understanding what it is we're worried about that the perpetrator is going to do. So we have to think about what that person's done in the past. So we look at all the past and previous patterns of their violence, and that's going to tell us a lot. We also want to consider any development of new patterns of behavior or evolution of IPV. And we can do this kind of by considering a number of different scenarios. So the easiest one for us to think about always is the repeat scenario. We can think about what, is it likely that this person's just going to continue doing what he's always been doing, the same sort of simple pathway. Now the problem with only considering that is that offenders are creative. They can change. They evolve. So we have to not just assume that violence is always going to be the same. A threat assessment has to consider a twist, a possible change in the motivation. The victims, we know that there are possible multiple victims of violence, not just maybe the obvious person, but it might be the new boyfriend, the children, the mother-in-law, and so forth. Are the behaviors going to change? So thinking outside the box, that's how we prepare ourselves. This is how people do this in emergency planning. We have to think if an earthquake were to hit Vancouver, that's my hometown, tomorrow, are we prepared? We do that by trying to imagine all the different possible outcomes. The one we're always concerned about, and it's relevant to this conference, is the lethality or worst case scenario, and I'm going to be talking about that in some detail this afternoon. We always want to ask that question: is this going to escalate to lethal violence? And if it is, how does that unfold? What is going to have to happen for that to take place? If we can do that, now we start to get somewhere. We're thinking about what warning signs we're going to be looking for. We, of course, want to imagine an improvement scenario. Sadly, those aren't always very common. So always consider in our scenarios the nature, severity of the violence, the imminence of the violence, the likelihood, and as I said just a minute ago, think outside the box on the victims, because again, we can have multiple possible victims. We can even have multiple perpetrators, right? So if we think that in extended family violence, sometimes we call this so-called honor-based violence, or on a scenario of that nature, we might have multiple perpetrators and multiple victims. So it can get actually complicated. The notion that intimate partner violence is always one perpetrator, one victim, in my experience, and I think yours as well, is not typically the case. We often have many people we're concerned about. So the last step then, in our process, and this is what we want to train people to think about, is how do we then link the risk management plans to our scenarios, to our identified risk factors. So we're going to target the relevant risk factors. If it's substance abuse, we're going to try to make some recommendations about how to manage that. If it's issue about static security for the victim, security around her home or workplace, we're going to try to address that. We want to specify be as specific as possible as we can. Tailor our plans to individual cases. Every case is different. The strategies, can't say the word strategies at 8:30 in the morning, but they should be feasible, practical, and contextual. So you can go through a laundry list and ask for the world in your risk management recommendations and say, he should be getting this world-class treatment and she should be getting all these support. But if we don't have the resources, it's really kind of a useless recommendation to make. So we always ask you to think, let's stick to reality. Let's make recommendations that are actually practical and useful. And the last point here is that whenever possible, we should be linking a risk management strategy to an individual or agency. So somebody has to own it. Somebody has to take ownership for the intervention. Or again, it's kind of useless. The reports will just drift. Nobody will read them. So who's responsible for what? And a multi-agency approach, I think, is the way to go. I mentioned in the ICAT teams here, it's the multi-agency approach that I know the best, that's used in a lot of communities in BC. Debbie Hamilton, who was instrumental in developing these things, we worked together. I think that kind of approach where everybody can, if you can get through the information sharing protocols and sit together and identify the high-risk cases and work together, identify who's doing what, that's the way to go. I understand it's not always practical, but that's what I would recommend. We have to be aspirational here, try to get to the point where we can do that, but I understand it's not always practical. So the strategies, I've run out of time, but the strategies that we would say, this is a risk management plan. If we can't address these 4 areas, we haven't actually got a risk management plan in place. We have to think about monitoring strategies, very active monitoring, supervision, what controls, restrictions are we going to place on that perpetrator, what treatment or rehabilitation recommendations we're going to make for the perpetrator, and how are we going to enhance the victim's safety. Not any one person or agency can do all this. That's why the multi-agency approach is really important. Agencies need to communicate about what they're doing, and I honestly believe that's the best way we can go with this. I'm really blowing it, I'm sorry, but we actually have direct prompts, questions to ask about those 4 areas, and to remind people what the goal is, what the ultimate task is, and that is risk management. We should really just call it risk management. I think that's a better term for what we're trying to do here. Thank you.
I'm going to talk with you about some of the cultural context that we should consider, including the challenges that we would face when we work with newcomer victims of domestic violence, and in particular, those who are coming from a collectivist background. So, I guess for me, from some of the experience that I have been involved with, as well as some of the research, most of the time when we talk about barriers of accessing services by women who are at risk of domestic violence, or maybe who are victims of domestic violence, unfortunately, from my humble experience, we repeat the same barriers that sometimes actually would not really make a lot of sense. We see, for example, in many cases, like Shafi'a case in Kingston, all the organizations and agencies have done everything the protocol would tell them about risk assessment, risk management, but then tragedies happen. And at the same time, also yesterday, we heard from Maha, the police involved. There is so many things already has been taking place, but tragedies happening. And I think there's some blind spot here when we talk about newcomers, when we talk about really diverse cultural communities. I would really encourage everyone also to maybe ask a question, what do we don't know? Because if you don't know what you don't know, most likely your intervention, your assessment will not be really accurate. So I'm going to talk about 3 main things here. The first thing is really to share with you some of the challenges related to risk assessment and risk management in relation to newcomer families. The second point is really the consequences. If we would not be overcoming these challenges, what would happen? And the third point, really trying to provide you with some key aspects to consider as solutions for assessing risk in a collectivist context. So the first main challenge here, really, just in terms of framework, philosophically, we need to understand that there is 2 conflicting concepts of protection and safety. So many women who are coming from a collectivist background, safety and protection for them really rooted in their belonging with their collective entity. So meaning within a collectivist context, the self notion is rooted within the collective entity. So when you speak with a woman who is experiencing violence in this, from this cultural context, empowerment and self-esteem and all these things are really important, but then without taking into account how, for example, this woman will perceive herself, what is important to her, it's really would not really get you in a place where you can really maybe save this person who would be, or this woman who would be at risk. So the second thing that we consider as challenge here, we're talking about different kind of also concept. I'm not really generalizing here. I'm talking specifically about those women who are isolated. Not any woman or any man who is coming from a collectivist background will have the same kind of belief system, attitudes, or behavior. But I'm really talking about those isolated women who already we fail to protect them. And we know many, many cases that we are dealing with. So the second challenge is really, we are talking about families coming from a collectivist background that really role-oriented. So they define themselves based on their roles: a wife, a husband, a father, a mother, and that would have some kind of consequences in terms of really where you situate yourself based on your role, and not necessarily based on your, 10 minutes, thank you. I promise, not 10 hours, okay. So really, basically, it's, oh my God. Anyway, it's important to consider really that the role determine or define, how the decision that you would make in terms of your behavior. Are you going to leave the relationship? Are you going to stay? How far you want to compromise or to navigate the system within the abusive relationship, or maybe going to another extreme, ask for outside help, and what does that mean to you in terms of your role and the consequences, in relation to your relationship with your family, with your extended family. So it's important to understand that concepts to really be able to help women who come to you and ask for help. So the third thing also in terms of challenges, collectivist communities really, they focus more on preserving family is really a priority. And also that's based on the role. So again, also the role of extended family, not only within, for example, the community of origin here, but also back home. We deal all the time with women and sometimes also men who are really at risk of perpetuating violence. You see the dynamic, they connect families back home, and maybe they listen to them more than they listen to someone here who is a counselor or maybe advocate. Shame of betraying the family, a huge factor that maybe force many women to stay within, an abusive relationship. So that all mean really that something that we really need to think about the way we do our service or the way we work with women experiencing violence from a collectivist background. And we need to really to acknowledge there is two systems. The individualistic system of intervention, assessment, and also management, and also the family, the collectivist system of families coming from a collectivist background. So if you don't understand that, no matter how brilliant we are, as Randall said, context is really important. So then that will not really lead us to somewhere where we can really help this woman. So where that would lead to? So really the consequences, if we don't really understand these challenges, and at the same time not doing anything about them, what would happen? So the woman will be at risk, experiencing violence, would be reluctant to outreach formal service. And we have said that several times, everybody was talking about that, not because they don't know the services, or maybe they don't understand the language, no, because that would put them really in a psychological dilemma to make a decision and choices. Are they going to stay within what they know, the devil that they know, or maybe they would try something different, and maybe the consequences will be maybe more dangerous to them. The same thing also with male, who maybe yesterday we heard, for example, depression and mental health pre-migration trauma. So that also would note, as a consequence, this man would not ask for help. We know, for example, generally speaking, men are reluctant to ask for help, but with this context, even more difficult. So that also will increase isolation or social isolation of women experiencing domestic violence. And social isolation for a woman, another 10 minutes? No. So, what's going on here? Okay. Yeah, so we also see then, as a consequence, family and community become more involved in protecting the family unit on the cost of the victim. And that happens often. If a woman, for example, go and ask for help, and one would go to the shelter, and then she would not really see what she's expecting, she will go back. And when she would go back, she will be really more at risk. And she'll be more submissive, and she will accept and regret, and that would put her really in more dangers. So also as a consequence of not addressing these challenges, a traditional approach of outage, newcomer women at risk, will fall short of meeting the unique needs of abused women. I mean, we know that we have best practice, we have really wonderful strategies, but if you don't understand the cultural context of these families, women and men, and how they make sense, whether, for example, a man how he justify his abusive behavior, and the woman, for example, how she would, I would not say justify, but really tolerate, the risk that she would live in or with. And that all would really heighten the risk of violence and potential risk of domestic homicide. So finally, those are really some of the key aspects that I want you to think about and to consider to be able to really address, understand, respond to domestic violence, and also help better assess a risk that could maybe lead to domestic homicide. There are 4 aspects that we need to consider. We created a screening tool, risk assessment screening tool. This afternoon, we're going to explain that in details in our workshop. And those are really the 3 areas: cultural aspects, migratory experiences, and the role of religion. In the literature, in the practice, we know those aspects are really important. The problem is we see or consider these aspects as problems. They could be risk factors, but also they could be protective factors. What I'm really trying to encourage everyone here to look at those factors as protective factors, as a strength. So yesterday we heard Maha was saying about the cultural pressure. I think, most of the time we don't have the right lens to address these cultural barriers. In our situation at the Muslim Resource Center, because we are in the middle between the Muslim community and the mainstream service, so then we can create this kind of safe space, so women can come to us, so then we can, bridge with the services. So the cultural aspects in particular, we assess the level of cultural rigidity. I'm originally from Yemen, a tribal society, but not everyone who is coming from the same background will have the same kind of rigidity. It's not about really, judgment. It's about understanding. So some people who are coming from villages, they don't even write in Arabic. They didn't see a city, and all of a sudden they are here in Toronto or in London. So then we need to understand that, because if you just say, okay, here is Canada, you cannot do that. If you do this, we'll take you to jail. That's not going to help. So the cultural aspect is really important. Migratory experiences, in particular pre-migration trauma. 10 years ago, 2 minutes. Okay. 10 years ago, I did a research, and I actually found out there is a single question that asks any family, a woman or man, about their pre-migration experiences in general, period, in all these services. Now, after we experience Syrian influx, people coming from Uganda, from any other places, started to talk about pre-migration trauma and PTSD and how that would impact, domestic violence or domestic homicide. So migratory experience is not just pre-migration, also post-migration. people who are coming here really finding difficulties to adjust with the new system. Everything is new. Finally, the role of religion. I know religion is sensitive, but in terms of family relations, many people, religion is really for them a moral reference. They want to make sense of what they are doing based on what they believe in. It's another thing to accept that or not, but we need to understand that if people really use religion to justify violence or maybe to tolerate violence, we can always differentiate. It's not really about judging people, but it's really about understanding, how, for example, this person, use religion to justify their violence. In this afternoon, we're going to talk about the 4-aspect screening tool, and also we will talk about how, for example, the Muslim Resource Center has been able to understand, identify risk factors related to migration, culture, and the role of religion in particular, and come up with some kind of early intervention strategies to interrupt escalation of domestic violence that could lead to domestic homicide. Believe me. So just one last thing, honestly, it's very important. I have been saying that for many years now. We talk about culture, we talk about so many barriers, but then we need to translate that also into first sharing leadership and responsibility with organizations like ours, the Muslim Resource Center. I'm not saying the Muslim Resource Center, just really culturally based organization. When you want to work with isolated communities, you also need to really understand and to honor the asset that these communities can bring to be part of the solution and not really just being seen as part of the problem. Thank you very much. 10 minutes? Wow.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to, first of all, introduce you in my traditional name. And my name is Nepinak, and that is from the Anishinaabe people from the Treaty 4 area. And my colonized name is Josie Nepinak, Executive Director for the Awutan Healing Lodge Society in Calgary. Can we bring up? Oh. So I've put up this picture, first of all, to acknowledge the unceded traditional territory of this area. And that is the Chippewas of the Thames, Oneida Nation, part of the Haudenosaunee people, the Munsee, Delaware Nation. Thank you, as I am a visitor on your territory today. Miigwech. I'd like to tell you a bit about Awutan Healing Lodge Society. We are an emergency women's shelter based in Calgary, Alberta. And we've been in operation since 1992. And our clients are primarily Indigenous women, immigrant women, and settled Canadians or non-Indigenous women. At the lodge, we use a healing lodge model as opposed to the crisis model. So we are based on a trauma-informed model, strength-based, as well as a family-based model. Our vision is nurturing families living in peace, and all of the families who come to Awutan Healing Lodge come in with severe family violence, domestic violence situations. And part of our role as staff, frontline workers, administration, is to ensure that we provide the best possible experience of healing for those families when they come into the shelter, which means that everyone who comes in becomes part of the Awutan family, and the children become part of we become aunties, grandmothers to all the children, and we believe that every child who comes in should be loved and nurtured and hugged and given that sense of safety that is so often required. So I'd like to show you three slides, actually, which we do danger assessment for the past 10 years at at Awataan, and it is the danger assessment that's been developed by Dr. Jacqueline Campbell. And this danger assessment is widely used by the shelters in the province of Alberta. And so we were curious about how we found that Indigenous women were scoring lower than many of, as opposed to our non-Indigenous sisters. And we also found the same for immigrant women. And we found that our non-Indigenous sisters were scoring much higher with the danger assessment scale, and Indigenous women were scoring 32% less than our non-Indigenous sisters, and which kind of led us to, okay, so what's happening? What do we need to be aware of? What are the considerations that we should be bringing forth to make or create a safer environment, to have folks recognize the level of danger that comes forth. And here is the scale that we use. So we found that Indigenous and immigrant women scored, fairly same. Non-Indigenous women scored much higher at 67%. So what are the risk factors? And I'd like to talk about some of those now. And points to consider around that, as well as when we develop risk factors, is to consider intergenerational trauma. And in this case, go back, I'm going to give you a definition of trauma as developed by Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across generations, including the lifespan, which emanates from massive group trauma. By this, we mean post-traumatic stress disorder, colonization in Canada, racist policy, to kill the child, kill the Indian in the child, loss of language, loss of ceremony, loss of culture. And this happened through the residential school experience. I was one of those kids that went to the residential school. So I'm often asked, how long have you been involved in the field of, which I prefer to call family violence? And I say, well, since I was 5 years old. Because at 5 years old, I went into the residential school, and that was my first experience with violence against children. And so that has become part of my history, part of my frame, and part of my thinking, and part of what safety means for Indigenous people, cultural safety. We also had the 60s scoop, which was involved. We now have child welfare and the highest apprehension rates in Canada. We have colonial policy, such as the Indian Act. And the Indian Act will determine who you are as an Indigenous person, and it'll determine at points where you get buried in this country. Property rights. We also, I need to go back. Okay, we look at intergenerational disadvantage as well. Generations of children, families who attended the residential school, that blood memories passed down, health disparities, long-term separation from families, for example, the 60s scoop, where Indigenous children were illegally apprehended from their homes and sometimes sold to different countries in the world. We have intergenerational poverty, social exclusion, and that was where we were often placed on isolated and remote lands, which are called reserves in Canada. And racism. We also have contemporary disadvantages. Again, I go back to racism. We know that in Canada that Indigenous people rate the second highest in terms of racism in this country. 63% of 63 communities in this, First Nations communities in this country are without safe drinking water. Generations, 1 or 2 generations have grown up without ever knowing what safe drinking water is. Children are still leaving the safety of their homes to attend schools because we don't have schools. I had to leave my home when I was at grade 7 to enter into another residential school to continue on with high school. Child welfare continues to be the next residential school. Unresolved grief and trauma. Significant loss of loved ones. Missing and murdered Indigenous women. More than 1,200 in Canada, and that's what the public record tells us. Many of us know who work the front lines that there are more than 3,000 women missing in this country. We have been made disposable. We have been dehumanized. I want to tell you about Cindy Gladue, a 34-year-old Cree woman from Alberta who was killed and her body parts brought into the courts in Alberta. I'm going to read you this little quote from Dr. Julie Kay, who is part of the Institute for the Advancement of Aboriginal Women, who assisted us with the intervenor status that we were able to be provided with for the courts. And all of this relates back to safety for and risk assessment or danger assessment for Indigenous women, because these are our experiences. They're part of who we are. It's and need to be considered. I'm going to read you this quote regarding Cindy Gladue. The justice system responded to her assault with its own measure of violence. In an act of complete and unprecedented dehumanization, her sexual organs, human remains, were brought into the court covered in a paper towel. The court referred to this portion of her body as a specimen, a portion of a woman's body, a sacred, life-giving body that was paraded through the Canadian criminal court system, the very system that dispossessed Indigenous women from their land and that continues to criminalize their lives at staggering and ever-increasing rates. That was about Cindy Gladue, and so what happened with that is through the appeal has gone through, so the man who killed her will once again go for trial. Tell you about Angela Cardinal out of Edmonton, who is a victim of sexual assault. And for some reason or another, the judge ordered that she go to prison as well. But she was in the same or close proximity to the same cell as the man who assaulted her, where she could actually see him. And not only that, but when they were taken to court, she was put in the same van to ride with this man who assaulted her. I want to tell you about Barbara Koechner, First Nations woman, 34 years old, Thunder Bay, Ontario. In January of 2017, she was walking down the street and a trailer hitch was thrown at her, hitting her in the abdomen. And there was a carload of 3 young men, and one of the men threw it at a fairly high speed, threw out the trailer hitch to her and laughed and said, "Yeah, I got one." And since then, Barbara Koechner passed away on July 4th of 2017 this year, and we don't know yet whether or not this young man will be charged. I think that's still pending some autopsy results, but so that's part of the experience of Indigenous women and the contemporary disadvantages that we have. But having said that, I'd like to as well build and talk about the resiliency that we have, is that we are very strong. We wish to be part of the research. We wish to be part of the policy making and to participate in a meaningful way, not as subjects of violence, but rather we want to be active agents in that work that is conducted. Talking with my colleagues throughout the last few days we need to have a danger assessment tool that is specific to our experiences as well, because our experiences, Indigenous men often have those same experiences as well that need to be considered. We need to build on community protocol, Indigenous healing models, our elders need to be actively involved, our community leaders to be involved, and Indigenous women to lead. These are very uncomfortable areas, but must be considered if we're to create safer communities. Like to, 1 minute left, okay, I'm going to go to Archibald, who's from the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, who said that models, approaches, techniques, and initiatives that are based on Aboriginal experiences that feel right to survivors and their families, and that result in positive changes in people's lives. So models need to reflect who we are as Indigenous people. We need to see ourselves in that, in the danger assessment models, so that we can then take them back to our communities and manage that risk and that vulnerability in a way that we create safer communities and save lives. Thank you very much.
Wow, my topic is judicial accountability and domestic violence, and it's difficult to follow those very profound comments about what can go wrong in our justice system. So thank you for sharing that with us. I wanted to start by acknowledging the work that I've done over the past 5 years with Dr. Margaret Jackson, who is here with us. We've worked over 5 years on looking at issues surrounding family violence, primarily in family law cases, and that led to an article that's on your screen, published in a Canadian journal just this last spring, called Family Violence and Involving Judicial Roles, Judges as Equality Guardians in Family Law Cases. That report, and what I'll speak about, involved 2 research studies were involved in. So what I'm saying will also reflect Margaret's views. So I do want to say, and you'll know this, that there are wonderful judges across the country who care deeply about family law and the challenges of that domestic violence pose, and they work very hard to address those issues. I'm speaking about concerns relating to courts as institutions. Our research shows that there may be concerns in our judicial system in that we may be applying outdated traditional approaches to judicial accountability and responsibility and qualifications to the needs of our modern justice system, which makes judges accountable to women and children as guardians of our constitutional values, and in particular, the fundamental value of equality that's found, as you will know, in our charter and other human rights instruments. So we concluded that doing this may increase the risk of harm to women and children in 3 ways. The first one would be lack of relevant information provided to judges about domestic violence and risk. The second one is that there may be inadequate qualifications of some judges to actually assess domestic violence and risk. And the third one is the separate or siloed operation of court processes in these cases between family and criminal proceedings, and it can also include child protection proceedings. In the time I have, I will just touch on these 4 topics. What do I mean by a traditional justice system? What are the requirements of a constitutionally enhanced family justice system? Our 2 studies and their findings, and then our recommendations. So by a traditional justice system, and I'm talking about one that's developed more than 100 years ago, it's one where judges are viewed as neutral arbiters. In other words, they only decide cases based on the evidence that usually lawyers provide to them. They're not specialized. So I use the example on the screen where you can have a judge who the day before the judge was appointed specialized in corporate mergers, and then the day after the judge is appointed, he or she hears a family law case. Judicial education isn't in that system mandatory, and courts operate separately or in silos. The modern situation that we have, judges do have responsibilities to incorporate equality principles into their decision making. And in order to do that, and we've been hearing about that yesterday and this morning, they have to have in-depth, up-to-date understandings about equality principles, including discrimination presently and in the past against women and children. And they need to understand the complex, multifaceted nature of domestic violence, its impact, and as we've been discussing, how it should be addressed. So equality is a fundamental constitutional value, and I won't go over this, but on your screen are some of the equality values found in the charter that specifically apply to women and children. And speaking about children as a vulnerable group, as many of you will know, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which Canada ratified just over 25 years ago, says children have the human right to be protected from violence of all kinds, to have decisions about their best interests made by qualified professionals, which obviously includes judges, and to have decisions made without delay in child-friendly processes. Another important issue is what I've called judicial aptitude, judging without bias using equality values. And Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin makes the, I'm sure, obvious point, and she's speaking in the quote that I have on the screen to judges, saying that judges obviously, like everybody else, possess preferences, convictions, and yes, prejudices, and so they need to deal with those and address them, and they need to do that understanding equality principles. Summary of the research. I just need to give you a little bit of background about the British Columbia Family Law Act, which formed the basis of our research. We got this new legislation passed in 2011 and effective March 2013. It's quite a good piece of legislation which takes into account many of the risk factors that we've been talking about, hearing about here, and says that judges must consider a number of very specific risk factors relevant to identifying domestic violence and specific factors relating to the risk of harm, and it very specifically says judges must consider other relevant criminal and civil proceedings. So also by way of background, and again, as many of you will know, in British Columbia and many other places across the country, we don't have specialized judges. Judges hear all sorts of cases. Today, for the most part, judicial education is not mandatory for judges, and today, in most places, and there are some notable exceptions, courts continue to operate in silos. So our first study was back in 2012. It was a community consultation with 42 people and institutions supporting women, and they identified a number of concerns relating to the three areas we have identified, but most of them were pretty keen about the Family Law Act and thought it would make a difference. So Dr. Jackson and I decided some 3 years later to do a follow-up study, and it was exploratory and qualitative, and in it, we spoke to lawyers and 9 judges who helpfully met with us from the British Columbia Provincial Court and Supreme Court. And the results between the first study and the second one were strikingly similar, and lack of information about domestic violence and risk was among the concerns. The judges as a group said, as you can see, it's uncommon that they're provided with information about the risk of future harm. And individual judges, as you can see, say that it's sometimes a challenge to muster even a basic case, and sometimes lawyers devalue or don't emphasize risk in these cases. Most of the judges said they would not ask for information if it isn't required. So this would specifically deal with whether they would ask for information about the factors for domestic violence and risk in the Family Law Act. They said they wouldn't because that's not their job. They see themselves, those judges, more as neutral arbiters, and they said they often have to put blinders on. So qualifications, I'll go through this fairly quickly given the time that I have left, but there were concerns the lawyers and the community consultation people raised about judges and their qualifications, and in particular, the issue of judges' qualifications in judicial dispute resolution meetings, where judges sometimes started with a presumption of joint parenting without even knowing the particular circumstances of the family. And then the siloed court proceedings issue was a huge one in the community consultation part. The judges were very clear that they didn't usually know about other court proceedings. One judge said there can even be 2 proceedings in the same courthouse. And one judge made the point that the fact that there haven't been more cases of serious injury or death due to conflicting court orders is more due to good luck than good management. So recommendations, quickly, they won't surprise you. We say that judges, to be accountable to the people that the justice system serves, need to take on a judicial oversight role by asking the appropriate questions. They don't have to become advocates for one side or the other. They can ask questions in a neutral way that's fair to everyone. We think that judges in this area need to be specialized for the reasons that I have highlighted. And we know that back in 2013, the Canadian National Action Committee on Access to Justice actually recommended that we have specialized judges, and hopefully, they said, in unified family courts. With respect to the coordination of courts, back in 2013, there was an important study by the Federal Provincial Territorial Working Group on Family Violence that made some recommendations about how these issues can be dealt with. And the judges made some practical suggestions, which I won't have time to go through, but the slides will be available to you. So in the last just very short according to my timer, 1 minute and 31 seconds that I have left, I will just leave you with these thoughts. The National Action Committee on Access to Civil and Family Justice is led by judges, and they have made important recommendations, and 3 of them are these: the need to focus not just on access to justice, but on just outcomes, the need for the legal profession to undergo a cultural shift, a new way of thinking, and third, the need for action, not just words. That was said in 2013. It's almost 2018. While much good reform work is being done, unless we address these fundamental structural concerns, we're still caught up in an old way of thinking, which creates an unacceptable chance that courts may increase rather than address the risk of harm or death to women and children, leading to unjust outcomes. With such high stakes, we cannot yet again postpone to another day dealing with these pressing issues. The time for action is now. Thank you.
There are many barriers to people in rural areas receiving services, including risk assessment. And I'll speak about some of the work that we've done in Saskatchewan and some opportunities for improving our practice of risk assessment for people in rural and remote communities. The unique risks in rural areas make it harder for people to leave violent relationships and also change the way that we engage in violence risk assessment. Geographic and social isolation mean that people often aren't reaching out to the services, and the opportunities for risk assessment can be missed. We also know that if a rural woman leaves a relationship and stays in her community, her ex-partner often knows where she lives. So what we see is women who are choosing between staying in the relationship and going very far away, where they're giving up connections with family, friends, their job, and often their culture. There's huge financial barriers to leaving, especially for farm women whose financial future is tied up in their land, their crops, and their animals. And there's a shortage of services, and not just shelter services, but services for perpetrators and other services such as addictions services as well. Research and experience tells us that rural women are less likely to separate, more likely to suffer assaults after they separate, and for a number of reasons, they're less likely to involve police. So we know that if someone isn't planning to leave a violent relationship, they need to have access to risk assessment so that they can help to make choices that are going to keep themselves safer. Oops. So the goal of risk assessment is to help us look at past violence to predict the likelihood of future violence, with the goal of preventing another violent incident rather than just reacting when it happens. Domestic violence death reviews have acknowledged a number of factors that may not be contained in the actuarial risk assessment tools, which are often shorter lists of the most salient risk factors. While some of these risk factors may not be part of the empirical factors contained in a risk assessment tool, they're relevant when formulating risk management and safety plans with clients. So while the items contained in the risk assessment tools help us to approximate an individual's risk, additional information may be important for discussing with our clients and when helping to formulate those safety plans. So, for example, we know that many risk assessment tools do not contain animals, but the literature and research that we were part of in Saskatchewan shows us that animals are a significant risk factor. When animals are being harmed, people are being harmed. And further to that, ownership of animals is a major barrier to rural women leaving relationships. So therefore, it's important to take this information into account when formulating safety plans, and it's also important to have information sharing plans in place with other professionals like animal welfare service providers so that they can reach out and communicate when they're seeing warning signs. At PATHS, we provide training on the ODERA to our member agency staff, who are domestic violence shelters and services across Saskatchewan. When we were in the process of choosing a tool that would be used by domestic violence service providers, we considered a number of factors. First, we chose the ODERA because of its high reliability and validity. We needed a tool that would produce consistent results no matter which staff member was using it and would allow us to communicate those results to law enforcement with police having an understanding of what those numbers meant. While not all detachments are using the ODERA, many police in the province are using it. It's also used by victim services and by probation, and we know that it's being used in a number of other jurisdictions. So this made it a good choice for us, knowing that our staff would be speaking the same language as other professionals, including those who are working with offenders. Further, this tool is easy to use and quick to score, which was important to us. We needed a tool that could easily be added to the intake assessment information and other information that shelter staff are already collecting without making it too onerous on both the clients and the staff. We needed to ensure that it would be feasible to conduct a risk assessment with every woman who came into the shelter service who agreed to do so. I think a risk assessment tool in a domestic violence shelter or counseling agency needs to be accessible, affordable, and easily rolled out to large staff teams. And we know that the staff in the rural agencies have limited access to post-secondary training and to professional development training in general. They often have to go to urban centers to access that training, and the costs for nonprofit agencies to allow them to go and receive that training are exponential. So we've been trying to find ways to make this effective to provide so that all staff are getting it. Further, domestic violence professionals come from a variety of educational backgrounds, so it's necessary to choose a risk assessment tool that can be used by all staff who are working with clients. We provide a one-day in-person training on the ODERA, and our member agencies have also participated in the ODERA 101 online. And in the process of getting everyone trained and implementing the tool, we've come across a few challenges. And the first one is staff turnover. So while we'll get a number of staff trained in an agency, turnover will happen and we might end up with only a couple people left who are using the tool or who have the training. So then it'll sort of fall off. So we found that we have to continually be doing updated training and support to keep everyone, to make sure that everyone in the agency has access to that training. Because the staff are often working long shifts and they're working alone. So it doesn't work for them to wait to refer to their colleague who comes in on the next shift to do that risk assessment. We have to make sure that everyone has access to the training so that they can provide it to the clients when the clients need. And we've also noticed that the training and the case materials don't necessarily reflect the complex situations that our staff see when they're working with rural women or women from diverse backgrounds. And another thing is that we've noticed the staff can correctly score an ODERA when they're verbally communicating with a client or when they're scoring it off of the case videos. But when we provide the written certification test, sometimes people find it difficult. And I think that's because it's a lengthy test, it's written, and it involves police reports, which is different from the actual practice of how a domestic violence shelter staff would score an ODERA. So we're currently working with Zoe and her colleagues to address all of these challenges, to make the ODERA training more effective and to make it more accessible to our staff, especially in the rural areas. And further, in rural and remote areas, there aren't always shelters or domestic violence counseling agencies available. So it's often going to be a police officer or a medical professional that someone might be seeing in a situation of domestic violence. And in urban centers, there's specialized domestic violence units within policing. But in rural and remote, officers are expected to respond to all types of calls and to be able to handle it without that specialized support to be able to follow up. So therefore, it's even more necessary to ensure that staff in the rural areas are receiving that training. And just to touch briefly on this, because it's a longer topic, but as we're providing the ODERA training, PADS also provides training for our member agency staff on trauma and violence-informed practice. And as agencies have been examining their own practices in the process of becoming more trauma and violence-informed, some have initiated conversations about how risk assessment fits within a trauma and violence-informed framework. And I think this is an important conversation to be having because all areas of our practice need to fit within trauma and violence-informed thinking. And to us at PADS, being trauma-informed means collaborating and giving women choices with an emphasis on safety. I think it's entirely possible to do risk assessment in a trauma-informed way, and I would argue that to be trauma-informed, we should be giving access to all of the tools that we have available, and we should be giving women choices to have risk assessment done. Risk assessment tools are important because they provide a shared language between service providers, but we need to standardize the training and we need to standardize what tools we're using. To properly assess risk, we need to look at both victim and perpetrator factors. We know that when we're using the ODERA, that accuracy is greatly improved when we have information from both sides. But this is not possible without collaboration between police and agencies that work with victims and agencies that work with perpetrators. To do this, we need to understand that safety and working to prevent future domestic assaults and domestic homicides needs to come before concerns about information sharing between our sectors. Communication must also improve among family and criminal courts and among the courts and the service providers that are offering these services. Courts should be requesting risk assessments and be taking those results into account. It's crucial to discuss the results of risk assessment with the individuals that are impacted, both people who are survivors of violence and people who are using violence. And referrals must be made in a holistic way. So as well as violence treatment programs, it might be important to be offering things like substance use or financial counseling, and it's especially relevant in rural communities where there might not be a specific violence treatment program available, and we need to be a little more creative in terms of what we're offering and how we're connecting people with services. We also know that relying on law enforcement and physical separation through things like no contact orders isn't enough for rural women, especially given additional barriers with geographic and social isolation and reduced police response time. So it's necessary to make sure that these women are having access to risk assessment so that they can use that information to help make informed decisions about their safety. But in our experience, we know that risk assessment is not always being done in cases of domestic violence. And when it is, it doesn't always lead to a risk management and safety plan being put into place. Risk assessment is intended to be part of a comprehensive plan that includes safety planning and doing something to mitigate that risk. We also know that in rural communities, it's more common that a family member or a medical professional or a coworker or someone else is figuring out what's going on. So for this reason, we need to get information on intimate partner violence out into communities and into workplaces. The more people that have some information on recognizing and responding to intimate partner violence who might say something if they notice what's going on, that's going to lead to less missed opportunities. But funding is necessary to ensure that that prevention education can happen. And we also need funding to ensure that services for victims and services for people who use violence can be as available in rural communities as they are in urban centers. And we need to support access to services for rural people, including increased support for those outreach workers that are providing those services. And I think jurisdictions need to develop frameworks for using risk assessment. And this involves communication among service providers, communication with the people who are impacted, putting a risk management and safety plan into place every time, and seeing that those who have a role to play, such as police and probation, are receiving that information so that they can communicate it and do something to mitigate that risk. So with that, I'll leave it here with a few statements from the National Framework for Collaborative Police Action on Intimate Partner Violence that came out last year. And this shows us that interagency collaboration is key to enhanced community safety. Thank you.